welcome to World News Tonight. This evening we will be covering the events in Syria over the past 12 months. From foreign relations to an explanation of the first gunshot, we will fully analyze the conflict in Syria and how it's affecting every corner of the globe.
What began as a peaceful uprising against Alawite President Bashar al-Assad quickly mushroomed into a brutal proxy war that has drawn regional powers and has left up to 470,000 dead and 13.5 million fleeing Syria. Building up to the civil war in Syria, there was great economic and political instability. Bashar al-Assad failed to fulfill his promises to open the socialist economy and ease political oppression. There was high unemployment and widespread corruption, and state oppression found in Syria before the civil war. In March 2011, pro-democracy protests were inspired by the arrest and torture of teenagers who painted revolutionary symbols and slogans on a school wall. The Syrian government was quick to open fire on protesters, killing several. This encouraged more to take the streets. In retaliation and self-defense, the demonstrators in the streets began to take up arms. This violence quickly escalated and transitioned into a civil war. Rebel brigades were formed to fight against the security forces for territory. A UN Commission of Inquiry has evidence that all parties involved in the Syrian civil war have committed war crimes, such as murder, torture, and rape. Each party has been accused of using civilian suffering, including blocking access to food, water, and health services. While the UN and allied countries are attempting to support Syria and cease the fighting, this isn't helping. Now, obviously, this war has brought a huge humanitarian crisis. Over 4.5 million Syrians have fled their country since the beginning of the war. These 4.5 million refugees are now becoming issues in neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. They are struggling with one of the largest refugee exodoses in recent history. While the turmoil in Syria is affecting the world, those living in Syria are being impacted the greatest. Millions of ordinary Syrians are being forced out of their homes, schools, shops, and jobs. Many children cannot attend school because their schools have been destroyed, or they fear there are no teachers. Men, women, and children are being forced to live in fear in a country that was once safe and war-free. Now to Maia with the information on the internal politics of Syria.
Syria is in the midst of a tumultuous, unstable, and corrupt internal political situation, which has seen the ripples of the Syrian civil war spreading far beyond its borders. The prevalence of international terror group organizations habiting in Syria, a brutal and merciless dictatorship, and the influence of various sects of Islam fighting for control in government and parliament. Cumulatively, these consequential factors of anarchy establish an inhospitable environment that has made Syria into a place of ever-present deleteriousness and chaos. Syria is governed under a semi-presidential republic with military control. Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'ath Socialist Party have control over the region. In recent years, internal corruption, oppressive militant regimes, and social unrest have divulged into a powder keg of activity that has resulted in the Syrian civil war. The Syrian civil war has spilled across the world, with random acts of terror being carried out in many other countries by Syria's most domestically notorious group known as ISIS and its splinter groups. The civil war began as a response to the recent Arab Spring uprisings that have spread across the Middle East in 2011. Peaceful protests over children being tortured over anti-government sentiments being graffitied is what sparked the chaos, when government forces opened fire into the crowd of innocent civilians. More senseless acts of violence and atrocities began to be committed towards the civilians by the government over a span of weeks. In response to the government militarization of peaceful protests, the Free Syrian Army was founded as an opposition force to Bashar al-Assad's regime. To deter foreign support over the rebel groups, Assad released many jihadi prisoners to tinge and radicalize the rebels, making it hard to support the rebel group. But many of the more radicalized individuals began to splinter off and create various terror groups that had distant ties to the anti-Assad rebels, such as Jabhat al-Nusra, a de facto al-Qaeda branch. Other terrorist groups saw the conflict in Syria as an opportunity to gain weapons, territory, and recruits. The most prominent group, known as ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, has become a splinter group of AQI and has recently gained massive amounts of territory in Syria and Iraq, attempting to build a Sharia law-run caliphate. Alliances on both sides of the regime and the rebels have mutually found an opponent in ISIS, but the growing web of alliances and opposition forces have become so blurred, overlapped, and entangled that it is as if each power, both domestically and foreign, is fighting an individual war in Syria, which makes it extremely hard to fight one force, when it is a mutual ally to another. Take Russia and the US, for example. While Russia and the US are both fighting ISIS, Russia supports Bashar al-Assad dictator's regime, who the U.S. opposes. The U.S. cannot directly attack Bashar al-Assad for his use of chemical weapons on civilians or the other human rights atrocities he has committed because of the risk of inciting a war indirectly with a nuclear arms power the U.S. has already had high tensions with. Another player in the Syrian civil war has been the semi-autonomous ethnic minority of the Kurds. The Kurds have played a major, successful, and consequential counterforce towards ISIS, becoming a significant ally to the U.S. Yet they are currently fighting Turkey, who is also a strong ally of the U.S. in the fight against ISIS and Bashar al-Assad. Now to Natalie, who will pick up with foreign relations.
As far as foreign relations go, there are a few countries who have maintained positive relationships with Syria, and those would be Russia, Iran, and China. To begin, these countries have economic and ideological motives behind their relationships. To begin, Russia has an economic interest in Syria's arms supplies. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimated the value of Russian arms sales to Syria at $162 million per year in both 2009 and 2010. Russia also leases a naval facility at the Syrian port of Tartus, which gives Russia its only direct access to the Mediterranean. Ideologically, Russia wants to prevent American intervention in the Middle East. Russia doesn't believe in revolutions and wars to bring about stability. They are also uneasy about the U.S.'s real intentions behind its humanitarian efforts, and is concerned that it is using Syria intervention as a way to pursue its own political and economic interests. Our next ally is China. Similar to Russia, China is open to trade from Syria and has not placed any sanctions on Syria. China is also against Western intervention. Lastly, Iran has relatively good relations with Syria. The relationship began after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Both countries needed to come together to fight a common rebel, which was Saddam Hussein of Iraq. Syria also gives Iran access to the Mediterranean. Iran has supported the Assad governments with weapons in the current conflict, as well as Iranian soldiers fighting for Assad. On a side note, Hezbollah, a Shiite militant group, supports Assad's regime. Hezbollah is the strongest military force inside Lebanon, and its leaders pledged to support Assad. Hezbollah troops are fighting alongside Assad's forces, and Hezbollah also depends on Syria for its arms flow from Iran. Now back to Maia with the events of Aleppo.
With large amounts of opposition, allied and terrorist groups all fighting each other, it only makes it worse for the civilians who live in Syria, those who are affected the worst. With a refugee crisis of 6 million people and the city of Aleppo under siege, many innocent civilians, especially children, have died as a result of the fighting. The siege of Aleppo was enacted by Assad to barricade the city, starving opposition forces of food, medical attention, water, electricity, and other resources as an attempt to make them surrender. All of these factors, along with the constant use of barrel bombs over the city, this has not just affected the rebels held in the city, but the civilians who had no part in the war, who are consequently deprived of food, water, and have died. All while sustaining injuries sustained during bombings, where they are not allowed to seek medical assistance because of the deprivation of hospitals and doctors. The constant fighting has damaged some of the most globally consequential World Heritage sites, and is beginning to compromise the cradle of humanity and all of the history it holds. Back to Natalie with relevant economic ties to the situation.
The Civil War has also destroyed Syria's economy. The rule of the law is disregarded by extrajudicial killings, kidnapping, and torture. Since 2011, all the components of Syria's GDP have dropped drastically in terms of manufacturing and agriculture. Furthermore, oil output has dropped significantly because ISIS is taking control of many oil fields. Previously, oil accounted for about 50% of Syria's exports and about 30% of the government's revenue in 2010. Syria's economy depended upon exporting crude oil, minerals, petroleum products, fruits and vegetables, cotton fiber, textiles, clothing, meat and live animals, and wheat. Syria's top export destinations were Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and Libya. However, during the last 5 years, the exports of Syria have decreased at an annualized rate of 45%. Syria's largest imports include machinery and transport equipment, electric power machinery, food and livestock, metal, chemicals, plastic, yarn, and paper. Its top import countries include Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and China. Currently, Syria's external debt has reached $5.918 billion. About 22% of the country's pre-war population have left the country, and over 4 million Syrian children are not in school. Currently, Syria is under numerous trade sanctions, which is also contributing to its declining economic stability. The economy has declined by more than 70% from 2010 to 2016. With a 50% unemployment rate, the country's economy is in ruin and may take years to rebuild even if the conflict ends soon.
Breaking news. New photos have been released of the civilians involved in the conflict in Aleppo. The effects of the chemical attacks are detrimental to the Syrian people's physical and mental health. And here is one of the surviving victims. How you feeling? As you can see, the effects are great.